At 5:47 a.m. on August 12, 1943, a 2-year-old boy named Thomas Garrett walked through the doors of the Swan Island Child Service Center in Portland, Oregon. His mother had just clocked in for the graveyard shift at Kaiser Shipyard No. 2. She wouldn't see him again for 16 hours. Thomas didn't cry. He'd done this before. In his small hand, he clutched a metal lunch pail painted blue. Inside was a note his mother had written the night before, listing his favorite foods, his bedtime routine, and a single line at the bottom that read, "He's scared of loud noises." She knew the shipyard would be deafening today. 12-hour shifts of hammering, riveting, welding, the air thick with smoke, and the screech of metal on metal. She also knew her son would be safe because, in 1943, the United States had built something extraordinary. Not a weapon, not a ship, a promise. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe now. This is history that matters. The doors Thomas walked through that morning weren't temporary. They were oak heavy, fitted with brass handles, polished daily by the night staff. The building itself stood 3 stories high, with large windows designed to capture natural light from sunrise to dusk. This was an emergency shelter thrown together in a few weeks. It was a permanent structure built to last decades, designed by Pietro Belluschi, one of the most respected architects on the West Coast. Belluschi had designed schools, hospitals, and churches. He understood that buildings shape behavior, that light affects mood, that children need space to move and corners to hide when the world feels too loud. The Swan Island Child Service Center was his answer to a question no one had properly asked before. What does it take to raise a child while building a war machine? The Kaiser Child Service Centers weren't daycare. They were industrial miracles. Between 1943 and 1945, 2 facilities in Portland, Oregon, operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, caring for over 4,000 children while their mothers built the ships that won the war. These weren't volunteers. They were professionals. Teachers trained by child development experts at Columbia University, Stanford, and the University of California. Nurses recruited from hospitals across the Pacific Northwest. Nutritionists who had worked with the U.S. Public Health Service, designing wartime ration programs. The centers had infirmaries with X-ray equipment and isolation wards. Libraries stocked with over 2,000 books. Outdoor play yards covering half an acre, and isolation rooms for sick children whose mothers couldn't leave their shifts, couldn't afford to lose a day's pay, couldn't risk being fired during wartime production quotas. According to James Himes, Jr., the manager of both centers and a trained child psychologist who had studied under John Dewey, the goal wasn't babysitting. It was something far more ambitious. It was proving that America could build an entirely new model of childhood, one where mothers didn't have to choose between earning a living and raising their children well. And the numbers prove it worked. Between November 1943 and September 1945, not a single child died in Kaiser's care. Not from illness, not from accident, not from neglect. In an era when infant mortality rates hovered near 40 deaths per 1,000 births, when childhood diseases like whooping cough and diphtheria killed thousands annually, that record wasn't luck, it was design. In 1943, America faced a labor crisis that threatened to lose the war before a single invasion fleet left port. The war demanded ships faster than anyone thought physically possible. Henry Kaiser Shipyards in Portland were building Liberty ships, cargo vessels designed to carry troops, tanks, ammunition, and food across the Atlantic to Britain and across the Pacific to island battlefields. The original target set by the Maritime Commission was 1 ship every 10 days. That seemed ambitious, optimistic even. Kaiser's workers beat that by more than half. They built ships in 4 days and 15 hours. Some crews, working around the clock in shifts that blurred into each other, finished hulls in 3 days and 21 hours. This wasn't peacetime construction. This was industrial war, and it required bodies. Thousands of them. Skilled bodies. Bodies that could weld hull plates in the rain, operate cranes in the dark, rivet seams while standing on scaffolding 40 feet above the water. But by 1943, most American men between 18 and 45 were already overseas. The shipyards had drafted everyone they could find. What remained was a workforce that had been invisible to industrial managers for generations. Women, By the end of 1943, over 6 million American women had entered the labor force. They welded, riveted, operated cranes, and assembled engines. They worked graveyard shifts, swing shifts, and double shifts when production quotas demanded it. But most had children, young children, infants, toddlers, children too young for school and too vulnerable to leave alone. And in 1943, America had no federal child care system, no national policy, no infrastructure. Women either found private care, which was expensive and unreliable, left children with relatives who were often too old or too busy, or didn't work at all. Some left children with older siblings, which meant 10-year-olds raising 6-year-olds, while parents worked 16-hour days. Henry Kaiser saw this as a logistical failure, not a social issue. He didn't frame it as women's rights or progressive ideology. He framed it as engineering. If machines needed maintenance, you built maintenance facilities. If workers had children, you built childcare facilities. It was a supply chain problem, and Kaiser was very good at solving supply chain problems. The first Kaiser Child Service Center opened on Swan Island in November 1943. The second opened at Oregon Ship in January 1944. Both were designed by Pietro Belluschi, who had built schools, hospitals, and the Portland Art Museum. Belluschi didn't design shelters. He designed institutions meant to last. The buildings weren't temporary barracks thrown together with plywood and corrugated steel. They were permanent structures with foundations sunk 8 feet deep, walls built from brick and reinforced concrete, and roofs designed to handle Oregon's winter storms and summer heat. Large windows lined every hallway, angled to capture light from dawn until dusk. Ventilation systems, installed at significant cost, cycled fresh air through every room every 12 minutes. The floors were linoleum, easy to clean and soft enough that falling toddlers didn't crack their heads. The layouts followed principles of progressive education theory developed at Columbia University's Teachers College. Each center could house up to 750 children at a time, divided by age and developmental stage. Infants stayed in the nursery wing, where cribs were spaced 4 feet apart to prevent the spread of respiratory infections. Toddlers at separate play areas with padded floors, low shelves stocked with wooden toys, and windows positioned at child height, so they could see outside without adult assistance. Older children, ages 3 to 6, attended structured learning programs in classrooms that looked more like preschools and warehouses. Each classroom had bookshelves, art supplies, building blocks, and musical instruments. The walls were painted in soft colors chosen by psychologists who believed that bright reds and yellows overstimulated young minds. Blues, greens, and creams dominated. The effect was calming, deliberate, a refuge from the chaos of the shipyards half a mile away. The staff worked in shift that mirrored the shipyard schedule exactly. Some teachers arrived at midnight to receive children whose mothers worked the graveyard shift. Others left at dawn, replaced by the day staff, who would care for children until evening. Still others worked the swing shift, arriving in the afternoon and staying until the last parent picked up their child, sometimes well past 10 p.m. The children never noticed the transition. Teachers were trained to hand off information seamlessly. If a child was having a difficult morning, the incoming teacher knew about it before the outgoing teacher left the building. If a child had fallen and scraped their knee, the nurse documented it, and the next shift checked on them. Nothing was left to chance. According to internal reports archived at the Oregon Historical Society, the centers maintained a 1-to-5 staff-to-child ratio for infants and 1:10 for older children. That ratio was better than most private schools in America at the time, better than most schools today. Each teacher earned between $150 and $200 per month, roughly equivalent to $2,800 today when adjusted for inflation. That was competitive with factory wages, which meant the centers attracted skilled, professional educators rather than untrained babysitters. Many had teaching degrees. Some had studied child psychology at universities. A few had worked in experimental schools run by progressive educators like John Dewey and Caroline Pratt. They didn't come to Portland for the money. They came because they believed in the mission. Ruth Henderson was one of them. She'd taught kindergarten in Seattle before the war. When she heard about the Kaiser Centers, she applied immediately. In a 1982 interview recorded for the Portland Women's History Project, She said, "I'd never seen anything like it. The resources, the respect for children, the belief that what we were doing mattered. Most schools treated teachers like babysitters with lesson plans. At Kaiser, we were professionals. We had autonomy. We had budgets for supplies. We had time to plan lessons and observe children. It felt like what education should be." Lois Meek Stoltz designed a teaching framework that governed every hour of the children's day. She was a professor at Columbia University's Teachers College and one of the leading voices in early childhood education in America. Stoltz had studied under Edward Thorndike and worked alongside John Piaget during his visits to the United States. She believed that children weren't blank slates waiting to be filled with information. They were active learners who thrived on structure, autonomy, and emotional security. The Kaiser Centers implemented all three with precision. Children ate meals together at scheduled times, not because adults decided they were hungry, but because routine created predictability, and predictability created calm. They napped in dimly lit rooms with cots spaced exactly 3 feet apart to reduce the transmission of respiratory infections and allow children personal space even during sleep. They played outdoors every day, weather permitting, in yards with climbing equipment designed by occupational therapists, sandbox areas that encouraged cooperative play, and small vegetable gardens where older children planted carrots, beans, lettuce, and radishes. The children watered the plants each morning. They pulled weeds in the afternoon. When vegetables grew large enough to harvest, the children picked them, washed them, and ate them for lunch. This wasn't decoration or symbolic activity. It was developmental science rooted in decades of research. Stoltz wrote in a 1944 report submitted to the U.S. Children's Bureau, "Children who participate in growing food develop a sense of responsibility that cannot be taught through instruction alone. They learn patience, cause and effect, and the relationship between labor and reward. These lessons don't come from books. They come from dirt." The garden stayed active until the centers closed in 1945. Some plants continued growing for months afterward, tended by no one, until the land was cleared for industrial development. The infirmaries were fully staffed medical facilities, not first aid stations. Each center employed a registered nurse on every shift, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These weren't volunteers with basic training. They were licensed professionals recruited from hospitals in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco. They had experience with pediatric care, infectious disease protocols, and emergency response. If a child showed symptoms of illness, a fever above 100 degrees, a persistent cough, vomiting, or lethargy, they were moved immediately to an isolation room designed to prevent disease transmission. The rooms had negative air pressure systems that pulled air out through filtered vents, protecting other children from exposure. The child was monitored continuously until a parent could be reached. But mothers couldn't always leave the shipyard. Production quotas didn't bend for sick children. Missing a shift meant losing a day's pay and, in some cases, losing the job entirely. Wartime labor was competitive, replaceable. So the centers kept children overnight when necessary, sometimes for several days if the illness required extended observation. According to a 1944 operations manual preserved at the University of Oregon Special Collections, over 200 children stayed overnight at least once during the center's operation. Some stayed for 3 or 4 days while recovering from respiratory infections, ear infections, or stomach illnesses. Their mothers visited during meal breaks, walking from the shipyard to the center, spending 15 minutes with their child, then walking back to their station before the foreman noticed they were gone. The children didn't ask to go home. They felt safe. They had beds, meals, nurses who checked on them every hour, and books to read when they felt well enough to sit up. One girl, later identified in records as Margaret L., age 4, stayed for 6 days in March 1944 while recovering from pneumonia. Her mother visited twice a day, bringing drawings from her older sister and small toys from home. When Margaret finally recovered and returned to the regular classroom, her teacher noted in her file, "She seems remarkably resilient. No signs of distress or separation anxiety." She talked about the nurse who brought her soup as if describing a favorite aunt. Food was treated as medicine, not fuel. Nutritionists designed menus based on the latest research in pediatric health, caloric needs, vitamin content, and digestive development. These weren't cafeteria workers improvising with whatever ingredients arrived that week. They were trained professionals, many with degrees in home economics or nutrition science from land-grant universities. They consulted with doctors. They tracked growth patterns. They adjusted recipes based on feedback from nurses and teachers. Breakfast included oatmeal cooked with milk to increase protein intake, fresh fruit when available, and whole grain bread toasted and served with butter or jam. Lunch featured protein, usually chicken, fish, or eggs. Since red meat was rationed and prioritized for the military, vegetables were steamed or roasted, never boiled to mush, to preserve nutrients. Whole grains appeared in every meal, rice, barley, or wheat bread, to provide sustained energy without sugar crashes. Dinner repeated the structure with variation, ensuring children received balanced nutrition across 3 meals. Snacks were scheduled between activities, usually milk, fruit, or crackers, to maintain energy levels without disrupting appetite for main meals. The kitchens prepared over 3,000 meals per day at peak capacity, more than most restaurants in Portland at the time. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers were composted in the gardens or donated to local farms for animal feed. According to Catherine Lenroot, head of the U.S. Children's Bureau, who visited both centers in May 1944, the Kaiser Centers fed children better than most American families during wartime rationing. The meals weren't just nutritious, they were consistent. Breakfast arrived at 7:30 a.m. every day. Lunch at noon, dinner at 5 p.m. And for children living through chaos, children whose fathers were overseas, whose mothers worked 16-hour shifts, whose homes were crowded and uncertain, that consistency was survival. Food became a clock, a rhythm, a promise that the day had structure even when the world didn't. The mothers trusted the system because it earned their trust every single day. Mary Skirmerhorn was a welder at Swan Island Shipyard. She had 2 daughters, ages 3 and 5. Their names were Dorothy and Susan. Their father, Robert Skirmerhorn, was a corporal in the 34th Infantry Division, deployed to North Africa in November 1942. He wrote letters when he could. Sometimes weeks passed without word. Mary worked the day shift, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., 6 days a week. Her hands were calloused. Her coveralls smelled like metal and oil. She made $1.20 an hour, more than she'd ever earned before the war. In a 1944 interview recorded by the Portland Women's History Project and preserved at Portland State University's Special Collections, she said, "I didn't want to leave them. Not at first. I'd never worked outside the home. I'd never left my girls with strangers, but I couldn't afford not to work. Robert's military pay barely covered rent. We needed money for food, for clothes, for everything, and I needed to feel useful. I needed to believe I was helping end the war so Robert would come home. When I dropped him off the first time, I cried the entire shift. Couldn't weld straight. My foreman asked if I was sick. I told him I was fine. I wasn't fine. But when I picked them up that evening, they were happy. They'd painted pictures. They'd eaten vegetables, real vegetables, not the kind of junk I could afford. They'd played with other kids, made friends, learned songs I'd never heard. Dorothy, my youngest, ran up to me and said, "Mama, we planted seeds today." She was smiling. After a week, they started asking to go back. That's when I knew it was real. That's when I stopped crying. The centers didn't just care for children. They prepared them for a world that didn't exist yet. Teachers used progressive education methods developed by John Dewey, Maria Montessori, and Caroline Pratt. These weren't fringe theories. They were established teaching methods being tested in experimental schools across America. But at Kaiser, they were implemented at scale. Learning happened through play, not rote memorization. Children built structures with wooden blocks, learning geometry and physics without textbooks or lectures. They stacked blocks vertically, horizontally, creating bridges, towers, entire cities that collapsed and were rebuilt with new designs. Teachers observed but didn't direct. They asked questions. Why did that fall? What would make it stronger? What happens if you use a wider base? The children answered through experimentation. They listened to stories read aloud by teachers who treated books like sacred objects, holding them carefully, turning pages slowly, using different voices for different characters. The children developed language skills, vocabulary, and imagination. They learned that stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. They learned that characters had motivations. They learned empathy through fiction. They painted with watercolors on large sheets of paper pinned to easels. They sang songs, folk songs, patriotic songs, children's songs about animals and seasons. They performed small plays, improvised dramas where one child was a shopkeeper and another was a customer buying invisible bread. Older children learned basic literacy and arithmetic through games designed to feel like play. They sorted objects by size, learning comparison and categorization. They counted blocks, learning numbers without worksheets. They traced letters in sand trays, learning the alphabet through touch. The goal wasn't to create obedient students who memorized facts and repeated them on command. It was to develop independent thinkers who could solve problems, ask questions, and adapt to change. James Himes Jr. wrote in his memoir, Early Childhood Education, Living History Interviews, published in 1978, "We weren't running a school in the traditional sense. We were creating a model for what childhood could be if society took it seriously. If we funded it properly, if we staffed it with professionals, if we treated children like human beings worthy of respect rather than problems to be managed." By mid-1944, both centers operated at full capacity every single day. Over 4,000 children passed through their doors daily. Some arrived before dawn, others arrived after midnight. The staff never stopped. Teachers worked 16-hour shifts during peak production periods, when the shipyards demanded maximum output. Mothers worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when convoy deadlines approached. The shipyards built 747 ships between 1942 and 1945. Liberty ships, Victory ships, escort carriers, tankers, and troop transports. That's more tonnage than any private shipyard in American history. More steel, more labor, more precision welding than had ever been concentrated in a single location. The children who made it possible were raised in 2 buildings on the banks of the Willamette River, buildings that no longer exist. After the war ended in September 1945, federal funding for the centers evaporated overnight. The U.S. government had invested millions in wartime child care through the Lanham Act, which provided grants for defense-related community facilities. But the Lanham Act was a wartime measure. When the war ended, so did the funding. The centers closed in September 1945, exactly 2 weeks after Japan surrendered. The buildings were repurposed. One became a warehouse. The other was leased to a manufacturing company. Most of the equipment was sold at auction. The cribs, the books, the play equipment, all of it dispersed. Some furniture ended up in schools. Some was donated to churches. Some was simply thrown away. The buildings themselves were demolished in the 1960s to make room for industrial expansion. The land where 4,000 children once played, learned, and grew is now covered by concrete, parking lots, and shipping containers. The children grew up, most married, had children of their own, worked jobs that didn't require welding or riveting. Many never spoke about the centers. It was simply part of childhood, a place they went while their mothers worked. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth preserving. If you're finding this story valuable, please subscribe. These voices deserve to be remembered. This history is still being written. But the model didn't disappear entirely. It couldn't. Too many people had seen it work. In 1946, Congress debated the Federal Works Agency Appropriation Bill, which included funding for the continuation of wartime child care programs established under the Lanham Act. Advocates argued that women had proven they could work industrial jobs, that families needed 2 incomes to survive post-war inflation, that children had thrived in professional child care settings. But opponents argued something different. They argued that government-funded child care undermined traditional family structures, that it encouraged mothers to abandon their domestic responsibilities, that it represented government overreach into private family decisions. Congressman John Lisinski of Michigan, speaking on a House floor in February 1946, said, "This country was not built by mothers who placed their children in institutional care while they pursued industrial employment. It was built by mothers who stayed home and raised their children according to American values." The bill failed by a significant margin. The Kaiser Centers were never replicated. Not in Portland, Not anywhere in America. According to historian Sonia Michel, author Children's Interests, Mother's Rights, The Shaping of America's Childcare Policy, published by Yale University Press in 1999, the closure of the Kaiser Centers and the failure to extend Lanham Act funding set American childcare policy back at least 30 years. It wasn't until the 1970s that federal funding for early childhood programs returned through Head Start and other initiatives. And even then, the funding remained fragmented, underfunded, and focused primarily on low-income families rather than universal access. The Kaiser Centers had proven that universal, high-quality childcare was possible. America chose not to build it. The legacy survived in memory. In 1972, James Himes Jr. published Teaching the Child Under 6, a foundational text in early childhood education. He dedicated an entire chapter to the Kaiser Centers, calling them the most successful experiment in mass child care ever conducted in the United States. He interviewed dozens of former teachers and parents. One recurring theme emerged. The children who attended the centers remembered them as safe, joyful places. They didn't remember the war. They remembered the gardens. Eleanor Thompson was 4 years old in 1944. Her mother riveted hull plates at Oregon Ship. In a 2003 oral history archived at Portland State University, Eleanor said, "I remember the smell of the dirt after it rained. We'd dig holes and pretend they were forts. I remember a teacher named Miss Ruth who read us stories about trains. I remember feeling proud when my carrots grew taller than anyone else's. I didn't know my mom was building warships. I just knew she came to pick me up every night, and she looked tired but happy. I thought everyone lived like that." The statistics tell a different story. According to data from the U.S. Women's Bureau, over 2.5 million American women worked in war industries between 1942 and 1945. Of those, an estimated 1.8 million had children under the age of 10. Less than 10% had access to employer-sponsored child care. The rest relied on informal networks, neighbors, relatives, or older siblings. Some left children alone. Accident reports from a period document dozens of cases where unsupervised children were injured or killed in home fires, falls, or drownings. The Kaiser Centers prevented that for 4,000 children. That's measurable, but the cost was measurable, too. Each center costs approximately $750,000 to build and operate annually, funded by a combination of federal grants and Kaiser Company profits. Parents paid a small daily fee, usually 50 cents per child. That fee covered less than 20% of operating costs. The rest came from subsidies that disappeared the moment the war ended. The facilities were demolished not because they failed, but because they succeeded without profit. Child care, it turned out, was expensive, and post-war America decided it wasn't worth funding. The women who worked at Kaiser didn't forget. In the decades after the war, many continued advocating for child care reform. Lois Meek Stoltz became a consultant for the United Nations Children's Fund, advising international early childhood programs. James Himes Jr. founded the Pacific Oaks College of Education, training generations of teachers in progressive education methods. Mary Skirmerhorn became a union organizer, fighting for workplace protections for mothers. Their work didn't reverse the closure of the centers, but it kept the idea alive. In 1971, Congress passed the Comprehensive Child Development Act, which would create a national network of federally funded child care centers modeled after the Kaiser system. President Richard Nixon vetoed it. In his veto message, he wrote, "For the federal government to plunge headlong financially into supporting child development would commit the vast moral authority of the national government to the side of communal approaches to child rearing over against a family-centered approach." The bill never returned to the floor. The Kaiser Centers remained an anomaly. Today, the site of the Swan Island Child Service Center is a commercial warehouse district. No plaque marks the location. The Oregon ship site is now a Daimler Trucks manufacturing plant. The only physical remnant of the centers is a collection of photographs held at the Oregon Historical Society. The images show children playing in sunlit rooms, teachers kneeling beside toddlers, mothers in coveralls dropping off their sons and daughters before dawn. In one photograph dated April 1944, a young girl stands in front of a mural painted on the nursery wall. The mural shows a ship at sea. The girl is smiling. Her name was never recorded. The ships those mothers built are gone, too. Of the 747 vessels constructed at Kaiser's Portland yards, only 3 survive today. One is a museum ship in San Francisco. The others are monuments in small coastal towns. The rest were scrapped, sunk, or sold for parts. But the children who made those ships possible are still here. They're in their 80s now, and some of them remember the gardens. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. History isn't just dates and battles, it's people. In 2018, the city of Portland considered renaming a public park after the Kaiser Child Service Centers. The proposal passed the Planning Commission but stalled in City Council over concerns about honoring a program tied to wartime industry. The park remains unnamed, but the debate revealed something unexpected. Dozens of former Kaiser children came forward to testify. They spoke about the teachers who sang to them, the meals that tasted better than anything at home, the feeling of safety in a world that was burning. One woman, now 81, said, "I didn't know my mother was a hero until I was an adult. I just knew she came back every night. The center made that possible." Someone should remember that. The Kaiser Child Service Centers operated for less than 2 years. They cared for 4,000 children. They employed 250 teachers. They proved that industrial-scale childcare could work, that women could build warships and raise healthy children simultaneously, and that society could choose to support both. And then they were forgotten, not because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways that didn't fit the story America wanted to tell about itself after the war. The women went home, the children grew up, the ships rusted, and the gardens where toddlers once planted carrots in the shadow of cranes, and welding torches were paved over. But the lesson remains. In 1943, when the nation needed labor, it built childcare. When the war ended, it demolished the buildings and erased the budget. That choice wasn't inevitable. It was deliberate, and the generations of women who came after paid for it. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, American women today spend an average of 22% of their income on childcare. In 1944, Kaiser mothers spent less than 5%. The difference isn't progress, it's policy. The Kaiser Centers prove what's possible. America chose not to repeat it. The story ends where it began. Thomas Garrett, the boy with the blue lunch pail, grew up in Oregon. He became a teacher. In a 1998 interview, he said he didn't remember much about the center, just the smell of oatmeal in the morning, the sound of his mother's boots on the metal stairs when she came to pick him up, and the feeling, even at 2 years old, that someone cared whether he was safe. He taught elementary school for 37 years. When asked why he chose that profession, he said, "I wanted kids to feel the way I felt back then, like the world had a place for them." That place was 2 buildings in Portland, Oregon. They stood for 673 days. And in that time, they raised 4,000 children, while their mothers built 747 ships. The ships are gone, the buildings are gone, but the children remember. And as long as they do, the story survives, not as nostalgia, as evidence. Evidence that America once knew how to take care of its people and chose to forget.